Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each of our hearts be acceptable to you this day, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Flexibility, or as my friend Jeff always liked to reinterpret it, flex-ability. This is my most enduring memory of Franny Millward as she stood in front of a group of 80 teenagers in the dining room of the Lots Creek dorm, a space that is not designed to hold 80 people, more like about 25 to 30. So that week when there were 80 of us who descended on Lots Creek, we needed a lot of flexibility, and we were taught that by the Queen of the Word herself. For those of you who've not had the privilege of knowing Franny, she was the founder of Church Street Ministries, the predecessor organization to Second Mile Outreach. And when she retired in 2015, at the age of 88, it wasn't necessarily her choice, but rather because her 3 children in about their 60s needed some care, and so Mama retired to take care of them. She'd been running that ministry since its inception 28 years earlier. She began Church Street Ministries at the age of 60. That definitely requires some flexibility, doesn't it? And although her ministry was based on Matthew 25, care for the least of these, Franny lived and breathed this message from the prophet Jeremiah. She was always ready to serve in whatever way or in whatever place God called her. Flexibility. It's such an important word for the church at this time, isn't it? In fact, one pastor whose sermon I listened to this week suggested that flexibility should become a spiritual practice, much like prayer or Sabbath. And I spent some time thinking about that, and I thought, what a great idea to make that a spiritual practice. Now, it's not often that I draw references from the military for a sermon. In fact, I can't imagine another time when I ever have before, but I love the motto of all the branches of the military when they talk about semper gumbi, that they are called to serve in whatever way is needed, so flexibility has to be their key. In fact, earlier this year, members of the National Guard in New Mexico were called on to substitute teach in classrooms where there simply wasn't enough staff to go around in the aftermath of the pandemic. I don't think National Guard members, when they signed up for service, ever envisioned themselves in their fatigues going in to teach a class of 3rd graders their reading lesson, or 7th graders their math, or high school students their English lesson for the day. It may be hard for some of you to think of flexibility as a spiritual practice because many of us are so fatigued from the constant changes that we've faced during this pandemic. But I'd invite you to keep your hearts and your minds open to the possibility that it could indeed be such a practice. Now, as someone who couldn't sit cross-legged even in kindergarten, no joke, and someone who fell down on the playground so often in elementary school that the school nurses knew I'd be coming in soon because the scabs were almost healed, I now, in my 60s, know I have to work really hard on my flexibility and my balance so that I can age gracefully and successfully. That's why I go and work so hard with my trainer each and every week, even when I don't really feel like going. But in addition to our physical flexibility, as the kids were demonstrating just a moment ago, we also need to be flexible in our hearts and our minds, because we know that if we leave our play-doh sitting out, not working it, as I'm doing here, because I just love to play with play-doh, it will dry up and crack and become useless. And the same happens to us if we don't stay malleable and relevant and keep working at things, then we too might dry up and crack. This idea of keeping moving and keeping being flexible was not always the most popular idea, as the young prophet Jeremiah found out. He was often sharing God's words with this pre-exilic Jerusalem community, and he was being ignored and attacked because he was far more flexible than the institutional forces that he was addressing. In fact, later in the very chapter from which Jennifer just read, the Israelites in Jerusalem say, let's make plans against Jeremiah. Let's attack him with our tongues. Let's not pay any attention to what he says. It's often what happens to prophets, isn't it? Especially when they're young. Some of you may recall or experience now when people don't listen to you because of your age. But it's always a risky response because prophets are speaking for God. And God doesn't put age limits on who has important information to share. In the passage from which Jen just read, Jeremiah is drawing an appropriate analogy to a potter at his wheel. The clay that he's working with is moist and malleable and can be easily reshaped. It takes a lot of skill to do something on one of those wheels. But with experience, one can create beautiful pieces of art. And when you find that you've created something that you don't quite like, you simply smooth it out, keep the wheel moving, and just reshape it. And if things get really out of control, if that pot's really getting cockeyed, smash it down into a lump and start all over again. But once you have your shape formed, the next step is to put it into the kiln and fire it. And then it becomes sturdy, right? It becomes utilitarian. We can use it to serve food on, or to drink our juice from in communion, or to eat our dinner from. But you know, if we drop it, it shatters. It can no longer be reformed. So I wonder if we might apply that analogy to the church. Over the last 100 years or so, the church has become like a pot that's been fired. It's become very sturdy and beautiful and reliable. But over these last decades, cultural changes have caused cracks to begin to form in the clay of the institution. And this pandemic has caused such an impact that it is shattered almost completely. If we look more closely at the image of the potter in the Jeremiah story, we realize that just as potters never waste their clay, always returning their unused pieces to the pile to be reformed in the next project, that same kind of thrifty economy happens in Jeremiah's story with regard to God reshaping humans. In fact, 2nd century scholar Origen of Alexandria calls this apocastasis. That's $1 million word. That means that things can be redeemed and restored to God. Because God is always willing, my friends, to give us another chance to get things right, to start new, to create something useful and beautiful that can be redeemed from this little lump. The question becomes, are we willing to be reshaped, to make the needed changes, perhaps in the way that we worship, or in who we welcome and how we do so, or maybe in how we spend our money? On the precipice of all of this change, we are ready to launch the Noah Project this week and next. And as we do so, I've been haunted in these last days by a question that a young person asked in a meeting recently when he said, but if things aren't working, shouldn't we be doing them differently? You know, many people have been resisting participating in the Noah Project. Some say that they're too busy. But we have groups, friends, every single day of the week, except Friday and Saturday. We have groups in the morning, groups in the afternoon, groups in the evening. We have groups on Zoom, so you can do it from your home, or groups in the church. We even have an asynchronistic group, which means you can log into a special group and post your thoughts and respond to the thoughts of others for people who simply can't commit to 6 weeks of getting together at a specific time, because we know some of you have really crazy schedules. This work is too important to ignore. We need to take advantage of hearing everyone's voice as we are being reshaped by God the potter. Other people have told me that they're just really tired of change. They're worn out and they just don't want to do it anymore. And you know, I get it. I really get it. Because we've all felt exhausted over these last couple of years, haven't we? We've been uncertain. Sometimes we've felt lost or even scared. But here is the really great news, my friends. We worship a God who loves us so very much that God doesn't feel any of those things. God is so anxious to reshape us, to reform us, that we can go forward even when we ourselves are uncertain. I'm not afraid to admit to you that over these last many weeks and even months, I have felt really uncertain. I've always in my ministry had a sense that God was leading me and I knew where to go next. And I have not always heard that voice recently. I've been praying like crazy. But I've learned over these last days that I too need to trust that God will reshape us all. That it's not up to me to have the answers. It's up to God. And God isn't going to let us down. But God is speaking through all of us. And so everyone's voice needs to be heard in this process. We need to pray. We need to listen to God. If you haven't yet signed up, please reconsider. You know, the other thing I've been thinking a lot about this week is about Franny. How even at nearly 90 years old, when she retired, she was still flexible. And I haven't seen her for a couple of years, but the last time I talked to her, nothing had changed. By that time, she was about 92 or 93. Still the same flexible, adaptive person who trusts God so completely, who refuses to give up, to be frightened, who only retired to take care of her ill children. And if Franny can do it, then why can't we? We just need to be flexible. This week I read about the Reverend Sasha McCoven of Mendocino, California, a talented potter who also happens to be a Presbyterian pastor and teacher. And she offered this great insight. She said that potters in Jeremiah's day were production potters. That meant that although they often created things that were beautiful, they were actually creating things for utilitarian purposes. If a piece didn't work out, then they just made another one just like it, because like the text says, they kept reworking until things seemed good to them. That's how production pottery works. And it's also how God works, because God doesn't say, oh, the church isn't working, so I'll just create a new institution or a new agency. No, God wants to reshape the church in a new way, to create something beautiful and useful, a piece of art, as it were. The question becomes, are we willing to keep ourselves flexible and moist and malleable in response to God? Do we refuse to dry out and become cracked? Are we willing to let ourselves be reshaped by a God who loves us so completely that God is just waiting to reform us into God's beautiful piece of art? Let's close with the beautiful words of Pastor Robert Iverson. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on all of us. May it be so.